too. I think we're live, and let me just say to everybody who is tuning in, I'm Walt Rakowich, and some of you will know me personally, and some of you professionally. But those who don't, I'm the former CEO of Prologis. Today, I sit on 3 corporate boards, public company boards, and I currently write and I speak about leadership. And so since retiring from Prologis, I've been watching the state of leadership quite closely. And, I've come to realize that there are some things that I learned that I'd like to share with other people. And I do that in my new book, Transfluence, where I talk about transformative influence. I talk about the opportunities that we all have to make a positive impact in the lives of other people. And I'm doing my very first LinkedIn Live today, and I'm doing this with someone I think makes a positive influence and impact on women and leadership in general. And I'm thrilled to welcome my friend Sally Helgesen here today. Sally's a speaker. She's a leadership coach. And according to Forbes, she's the world's premier expert on women's leadership, and I would have to agree. She's also the author of her most recent book, How Women Rise, and I welcome her today. Sally, great to have you here.
Thank you, Walt. It's wonderful to be here with you.
So, Sally, I just have to tell a quick story before we get started. Sally and I were together yesterday, and I told her that there was one passage in her book that was extremely near and dear to my heart, and it's chapter 16 of her book. And Sally, in that chapter, Sally says, and I'll quote, "One of women's great strengths is their capacity for broad spectrum notice, the ability to notice a lot of things at once. That neuroscientists have documented this capacity using functional MRIs, which give a picture of the brain in operation." She goes on to say that women's attention, for the most part, operates like radar, scanning the environment and picking up a broad range of clues. And I told her that this is near and dear to my heart because it best describes my wife. Her nickname, Radar. And, I have to tell you, she never misses a beat. It's a gift. It's a gift that I will never have. And Sally, I just want to thank you for helping me understand my wife just a little bit better in reading your book.
My pleasure. Yeah, that capacity resonates with a lot of people. I'm glad it landed the way it did with you, Walt.
It sure did. All right, well, let's get into some questions. Sally, obviously, you're a renowned expert on leadership. You truly are. And I'd like to just start off with you sharing with me a little bit about your passion to speak on the issue, and kind of tell me a little bit about how you got where you got.
Well, it was a winding path, but in the 1980s, I worked in corporate communications in New York City. I worked with a number of wonderful companies, mostly in telecom, and I loved the work I was doing. But I did notice, my radar kicking in, that the organizations that I worked for had pretty much no understanding of the ability of women as leaders. Women had been coming into the workforce for about 15 years at that point. But the thought of positioning women as leaders or women having anything strategically to contribute was just not on the radar screen, to use that word again, in the organizations that I worked in. So I really wanted to investigate what qualities women brought as leaders. And I undertook on my own time, I was writing speeches mainly for executives, to interview some of America's most successful and innovative women leaders, most of them in their own companies, to try to get a sense of what they contributed and be able to articulate that in order to convince organizations that women really had something to offer as leaders. And that research became the book, The Female Advantage, Women's Ways of Leadership, which was published in early 1990, still in print, and which I'm proud to say was the first book that looked at what women had to contribute as leaders rather than how they needed to change and adapt, which is basically what anything written on the topic in the 80s had been about. So since it was the first, people began calling me and asking me to speak to their women, speak to their executive teams. And I discovered that rather than writing speeches for executives, I could write speeches for myself and have some influence and sell some books. So I began on that path. I had some early help from some fantastic colleagues, and it just evolved from there. I wrote 6 more books in the field, did more research, and have spent the last 30 years traveling around the world, always with the mission of helping women to recognize, articulate, and act on their greatest strengths and understand what could get in their way.
That is absolutely awesome. And I can't imagine how many women you have affected over the years and just made an incredible difference in their lives. It's got to be gratifying for you to do that.
It's very gratifying, and it's been gratifying to watch new generations come up and find that what I have to say to them is as relevant as what I had to say to their mothers or their grandmothers some years ago.
Yeah. I'm just curious. I feel like the workplace has changed a little bit today. I'm kind of curious, do you think that the work environment today is any easier for women than when you started X number of years ago that you just described?
Well, I started my career in advertising in 1968. So it was the height of the Madman era. So I have something quite different to compare it to. Yeah. And certainly, if you take that 50-year view, it's changed enormously. It has changed tremendously. I know there's a certain amount of frustration. You think it had changed. It's 2020. I can't believe we're still having these conversations. But if you look back at what has really happened, women have much more confidence in their ability to contribute, much more eagerness to do so. Men are much more open to being allies and supporters, certainly than they were all those years ago. It wasn't even on something anybody was considering. And finally, there's so much more solidarity among women. Back, even going into the 80s, you'd find that when a company was having tentatively trying out to have some kind of retreat for its women, the senior women, for the most part, didn't want anything to do with it and they'd say, I'm trying to identify myself as a leader, not a woman. So because there was so much scarcity, I think there was a lot of fear around that. You don't find that today. So I see increasing solidarity, confidence, and participation by men. And it's not a perfect world out there, but boy, is it different than it was in 1968 in the advertising industry.
Oh, absolutely. And I see that. And, I can just tell you that I'm on a lot of boards, and there are the women that I'm on the boards with, it's been tremendous solidarity with. And they go toe to toe with the men. And the fact of the matter is that their contributions are just nothing short of terrific. And so that's been my experience as well. But I'm glad to hear from your perspective, things are making good progress, or at least progress is being made.
I think so. And that's a controversial thing to say, because a lot of people are very focused on what we haven't done. And that's important. That's an important piece of it. But I think acknowledging both sides is of value.
I agree. So in this book, How Women Rise, which I don't know that you mentioned, but I will mention it's co-authored by the legendary Marshall Goldsmith. It takes a look at professional behaviors of women and speaks of how they define success versus men. I thought this was very interesting. In one area, you explained that some of the key motivators for women include enjoying coworkers and clients, having control over their time, and believing their work makes a positive difference. From my perspective, I actually think these qualities are increasingly what we see in the modern workplace. And so my question for you is, can men learn something from women in terms of the way that women think about the workplace today?
Not only can men learn something from women, but men have, as you know, have learned much from women. And what has been extraordinary for me with this big, long perspective that I have is to watch the way in which the workplace and all our presumptions about what work is for and the role, purpose, and passion and mission and the development of character play in our work, looking at how that has changed over the last, say, 40 years. And the role that women have played in it, which I think is often under-acknowledged. So the workplace that has been evolving, and part of it has just been the changes in technology, part of it has been changes in demographics, part of it has been the switch to a knowledge economy, as Peter Drucker really foresaw, that a knowledge economy gives individuals more power, which makes them more comfortable asserting what they need vis-a-vis the organization. So I think that, and also just the way people have been rearing children to speak up for themselves and say what they need and have expectations. Sometimes I hear reports that can be irritating, but it also gives people real belief that work should be a satisfying experience. And so, yes, I find that men and women more and more also have this idea. Of course, work is for making money. Of course, we work to support our families and support the way that we want to live. And that's a key and important part of it. But we also, as human beings in 2020, and for the last 20 years, want to get more out of work. We put so much more time into work than people did 40 years ago. That we really expect it to be enjoyable and nurturing and to have relationships that matter.
Well, when you think about it, Sally, we spend, I hate to say this, but we probably spend 60 to 70% of our days, even these days, Saturdays and Sundays,
Yes.
Working. I mean, it's just, or at least our waking hours. And so we better make it good. I think about in the 70s when I was first hired in my first job, and leadership was all about command and control. And that's, to me, kind of leadership in maybe in a man's world. But I think, I got to tell you, I think leadership has gone a long way. And from my perspective, I learn a tremendous amount from the women that I work with. And I think where we're heading in the workplace seems to be more akin to the way women lead than men, and I think men do have a lot to learn. But that's just my bias.
Well, as I said, I definitely see that happening. There are pockets of resistance to it, and pockets of belief in command and control. But command and control is pretty difficult to assert when you have networked technologies that distribute power and information broadly, however flawed that execution can be. So I think this confluence, we've lived through this historical confluence. On one hand, women coming into the workplace, but on the other hand, a complete change in the architecture of technology and how we do our work and the impact that both of those have on the nature of the economy, the emphasis on knowledge products, which create, are more demanding for human beings to develop and can't just be easily replicated, but require more of our soul investment and intelligence in developing. So I think those three things have worked together to create something that's very new. And despite some of the hiccups and setbacks, and certainly this year has been challenging, that has enormous possibilities.
I think that's great. I've just learned something. I love what you just said. I do think that change is happening. And this next question actually has something to do with that too. In my book, Transfluence, I speak about the essence of leadership being transformative influence. A leader has transformative influence on the lives of those that they lead, and they need to recognize that. And I do think that one of the drawbacks about that is that some leaders they think a lot about themselves. I think it really starts with this whole notion of it not being about you. It's interesting in your book, and this was something that you'd written about. Marshall Goldsmith mentioned that he examined 20 habits of behavioral habits that routinely get in the way of successful people. And I think these habits sort of qualify, as I would talk about them, as being leadership thinking about themselves, not other people. They're sort of narcissistic tendencies, like telling the world how smart you are and claiming credit when you don't deserve it and failing to give others proper recognition and failing to express gratitude. So, but yet in your book then speaks to the limiting habits that women distribute, but being all about themselves is not really coming across as one of them. And so do you think that that's more of a problem, that let's just call it, broadly speaking, narcissistic tendencies? Do you think that's more of a problem that men have than women?
Yes, I do. I do. And I looked to the fantastic book that was published about a year ago by Tomas Tomorrow-Premuzic, who's a researcher and business investigator. And he wrote a wonderful book about, I think the title was something like, why are there so many incompetent male leaders? And his conclusion was that narcissism tends to be far more widely distributed among men who have the potential to position themselves as leaders. There are not that many women who are narcissistic who get in positions where they are in positions of real leadership and power, because it is so, there's an anathema that people feel when they're around a narcissistic woman that doesn't really help her career. So she's much less likely to climb up the ladder. And in fact, other research shows that women are perceived of by other women and by men as too much all about themselves, really are penalized in their careers. So that's one thing. Whereas for men, it's often perceived of as being very charismatic and very strong. We can think of many different examples that is mistaken. The narcissism is mistaken for strength and charisma. But you strike at something that's very, very crucial to how women rise. Marshall had written What Got You Here Won't Get You There, I believe it was published in 2010. And I thought it was a fantastic book. Just the underlying premise. What will help you early or midpoint in your career can trip you up as you seek to move into leadership levels. And he had these habits and behaviors that were most likely to do that. And some of them were gender neutral, but a lot of them, and just particularly the ones that you just read, I found very, very rare among women. And so I thought, while the framework is helpful, the specifics of it aren't that helpful to women. So I suggested to Marshall, who had been a colleague and friend for, at that point, about 20 years, I suggested that we collaborate on a book that took that framework of what got you here won't get you there, but looked at the habits most likely to get in the way of successful women as they sought to rise. And they were indeed very different habits, and they were much less all about me habits and more habits about, am I good enough? How are people seeing me? Am I really ready for this? And things like that reflected humility that sometimes was a problem.
I found that very striking in your book, and I thought it was absolutely terrific, and actually never really thought about it from a woman versus a man's perspective, but it was very, very eye-opening to me. I thought it was absolutely terrific.
One thing I should say, Walt, since the day the book came out in April of 2018, I don't think a day has gone by when a man hasn't come up to me and said, I identify with some of those habits. I identify with reluctance with overvaluing expertise, which is one of the habits. I identify with some of the perfectionism. So it's certainly not all men have this, all women have this, all men are, obnoxious self-servers like some of Marshall's clients clearly were who made it into the book, What Got You Here. That's not it at all. We're all a blend, but I think that women's experiences highlight certain habits that then become problematic as they seek to move higher.
Yeah. I would totally agree with that too. So I'd like to move on to one thing that you mentioned in your book, which I think both of us talk about in both of our books, and that's the importance of seeking outside advice. It's more or less the solution, to the issue, not what is the issue. Really, the first part of your book, you talk a lot about here are the tendencies that women have, but then, like all good books, towards the end, it starts talking about solutions. And I'm a big believer in assessing your own strengths and weaknesses as a leader. And sometimes it means that you've got to go outside and find personal coaching. You've got to find somebody else, personal board director, somebody to tell you the things that you could do better. You have a chapter on, quote, not doing it alone, I think, as you say, where you talk about the usefulness of coaching as well. And so for everybody tuning in, I'd like you to elaborate on that a little bit. And, can you address, if you can't afford a coach, because some companies will get one for you, but personally, if you can't afford a coach, what do you do? What's the alternative?
Well, I am a huge believer in not doing things alone. And whenever I have a problem, the first thing I think of is, okay, who's the person to ask about this? And that has served me very well in my life. Marshall has fascinating research showing out of a sample of, I think he and his partner on this project interviewed over 800,000 people worldwide in companies and found that the people who were most successful at making positive long-term behavioral change had one thing in common, and they all did not try to do it alone. They all had someone they worked with on it. So I think that the chapter you cite about don't do it alone is the most important chapter in the book. Now, the reality is, of course, that you don't get a coach until you're pretty high up in an organization, at least not one that the company is going to pay for. Personally, I have benefited beyond description from peer coaching, which is a concept that was introduced to me back in 2008. And I engaged a friend we served one another as peer coaches, and we have been at it now for 12 years. We talk about 3 times a week, and we really set out, it's not just how are you doing, we really set out, this is what I want to work on this month. And here are some of the, sort of tripping points that might trip me up. And here are some opportunities. So we go through it as if we were coaching one another. And we really hold one another to account for making changes. And I think that's the most important thing that I've done in terms of both professional and personal development in my adult life. So that's 12 years with a peer coach. It's a very effective process. But one of the things I talk about in the book also is just informal enlistment, engaging people to put their eyes on a problem that you identify. Say you feel like you struggle to speak up in meetings and you've gotten feedback that you can be inarticulate or you don't speak up enough, or when you do speak up, you're a little confusing, etc. Ask a couple people going into the room, this is something I'm really working on. I've gotten some feedback that I need to be a more effective speaker when I'm in meetings. Could you just watch me and let me know if there's something you think that would be helpful that I could do to be more effective? Am I speaking enough? Should I speak, more or less? Or you can ask somebody who's very effective and say, I'm really working to get to be a more effective speaker in meetings. You are terrific at it. I've been watching you. Is there anything you do, any kind of preparation that could be helpful for me that I could learn from? That would be helpful. So that informal enlistment, it has so many benefits. It kind of gets you out of yourself, gets you out of your fears about not being enough, for one thing. It gives you allies, and you're leveraging the relationships that you have in the service of your own self-development, which is very powerful. You're also advertising the fact that you're changing because you're talking about it. So people are more likely to notice, she used to sit in the room all the time in the back, and now I find she's speaking up. They might not even notice that if you didn't tell them that that's what you were seeking to do. So it is, and especially if you're a perfectionist, it's a great thing to do because it's a way of acknowledging publicly that you're not perfect and trying to grow from that. So I think that both of those things, there's no reason to wait until you can get a coach. Get a peer coach, practice informal enlistment, and don't try to do it alone. That's the best advice I can give to anybody.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. I was just thinking about sometimes you have to be vulnerable in your careers. I was just thinking about the way you defeat those weaknesses is to actually admit them sometimes. I mean, if you could admit them and be vulnerable about them, you kind of defeat them because they're out in the open. And everybody, it's okay if everybody knows about them. Okay, great. You know about them. So let's work on them.
Yeah. Yeah. And it gives permission to other people, especially if you're in any kind of leadership position. Here's someone who's comfortable, being forthright, not self-deprecating, not, oh, I always screw up and that. No, not at all. But somebody who's really being very forthright about what they're working on and eager to do that and has that demonstrates that kind of vulnerability. The advantages are enormous.
Sally, I'm just curious, when you were younger in your career, did you ever put together like a personal board of directors, or did you ever have anything like that where you had, 2 or 3 mentors that you were bouncing outside of the company that you were in, let's say, for example, but you were bouncing things off of them?
I almost always did. I almost always had former bosses. I did a very good job with turning former bosses into informal advisors. I didn't really have it as a board of advisors. I've got that now.
Yeah.
But, I didn't have that, but I was always, as I said, I've always had, when I'm presented with a problem, my first question is who? Not how, but who. Who should I ask? Who should I bounce this off of? And for me, it's been a very effective kind of thing. And instead of just spinning my tail and trying to figure it out alone.
Yeah, that's great. That's really great. So I just want you to hit one more thing that you've talked about in the past. You believe in 4 distinct powers that are at play in organizations: the power of expertise, connections, personal authority, and position. Can you talk a little bit about those, elaborate on them? And
Sure. This construct I got when I was writing the book, The Web of Inclusion, A New Architecture for Building Great Organizations, back in 1995. And I was doing a case study of Intel and the Intel Inside initiative, which had really bubbled up from the grassroots. It wasn't a top level decision, and it really turned the company around. So it was a very powerful story. And I remember interviewing Ted Jenkins, who was, I think, the 6th hire at Intel, if you can imagine such a thing. So he was the sort of keeper of the culture and font of wisdom at Intel at that time in the mid-90s. And I said to him, why is Intel so effective at getting strategic level ideas from people who are in the ranks, not with positional power, not at the level where you think that strategic decisions would come from? And he said, Intel is so good at that because we recognize that in every organization, I'm quoting him, there are 4 kinds of power. There's the power of expertise. That is how much you know, how much raw talent you have, and how much knowledge you bring to your job. There is the power of connections, who you know, how well you can get resources to flow by leveraging the network you have. There's the power of charisma or personal authority, and that's how much people trust you and how much they value your opinion and seek you out. And then finally, there's the power of position. That is the positional power. You hold the position you're in. And he said, here we see the power of position as only one kind of power. He said, most organizations I've been exposed to positional power is really all that matters. Other people who have other kinds of power are often looked upon as a threat to those with positions of power. He said, here we keep the power of position in balance, in harmony. And it was, it's sort of the Silicon Valley thing that the executives have to, get there early if they want to get a good parking space like everybody else. No giant offices and small offices, but just more a rotating situation. But I thought it was a really fascinating distinction that helps us understand a kind of toxicity that can develop in organizations when it's all about the power of position, and the person who is in the position to make decisions is never questioned, even when other individuals may have helpful observations, because the organization is so protective of positional power. And I think we're moving away from that. We're moving away from that because the nature of expertise is more widely distributed, and it's extreme. People have extreme levels of expertise that the positional leader can't hope to match. So I think the technology and the nature of the economy are driving us away from that overfocus on positional power, and it begins to look a little old-fashioned.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, so many leaders, as you climb the ranks, you realize that people that you're managing actually know a lot more about what you're doing than you do.
Of course.
And once you recognize that, you can focus on the fact that you need to treat them really well and treat them with dignity. Yes, and
exactly.
listen to them. Yeah. I could not agree with you more. So last final one or two questions here. Let's just deal with reality. We're in this COVID environment. It's not been easy. Do you see leadership changing as a result of this? Does this accelerate better leadership? How do you see this having an effect in future leadership for us?
I think more leaders are being held to account for when they don't recognize the impact this is having on their people's lives. The biggest problem that I've heard in this environment, besides, we're dealing with two things. We're dealing with a huge shift toward more and more people being able to work remotely, which is the acceleration of something that has been happening, but a very, very rapid acceleration of that. And that's going to change work going forward. We're also dealing with the fact that for a lot of people who have young children, the children are home, the parents are teaching them, there's no support, there's no help. And that's a very challenging situation, especially as is often pointed out for women. And that's a temporary situation, but it's nevertheless affecting people. And what I see is I hear from a lot of people who are, at the second or third level in an organization who are absolutely frustrated by the senior leaders who don't understand what their people are dealing with and say, well, this has to be delivered tonight. There's no wiggle room on it when people's lives are so much more complex than they were, or very, impatient when people have technological issues, which, we all have now because we're using so many different technologies and we're so reliant on it. Yep. So I think that there's going to be more pushback against leaders who are very demanding and whose attitude is, I don't care what your problems are. We need this now. Because that doesn't exactly work when we're in a situation like a pandemic, when we all have to work together to keep one another functioning and safe and keep some semblance of an economy. So I think probably a pushback against some of that, rugged individualism, demanding, driving boss, that's not working very well right now.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I can't tell you how many Zoom calls I've been on with dogs barking in the background and babies crying. And if you're not sympathetic to what that person on the other line is going through, something's wrong. I mean, you have to be. So one last question. What advice do you have for leaders in this day and age?
You mean specifically in this COVID era?
In this COVID era where we're in today.
I think that this is a fantastic time to let go of perfectionism, number one, of expectations, to understand that your expectations are your expectations. And that doesn't mean that they will necessarily be met because you're in a position of power. So I think there's a lot of learning to happen there. I think it's also, I read something that really influenced me. It was in the Financial Times, and it was an interview with the chair of the Tata Corporation, which is massive, Mumbai and London based. And he was saying, we always have been an early adapter of work from home. We had about 20% of our workforce working from home. He said, we anticipate that by the end of this decade, 70% of our people will be working from home. That is a massive, massive change in everything that's going to, just transform companies and, all complexities like, you just talk about it in terms of the H-2B visas. You're just going to have a huge change. So I think, this is also a time to really keep open and try to employ what radar you have, or the radar of the people around you, to see around the corners, to see what is this environment going to look like, because it is going to look different. And people who can give a subtle reading of it rather than either resist or, put their expectations at the apex of everything, are going to have a better chance of reading what the environment is and seeing the opportunities to move forward.
What a great bit of advice. Sally, I'd just like to thank you so much for being on today. This has just been absolutely awesome. And I learned so much. And I'd just like to, also thank you for being on my inaugural LinkedIn Live. So,
thank you.
I'd like to thank
it's great to be with you. I'm an admirer of your book and of what you're trying to do in the world. So,
well, thank you. And I'd like to thank everybody else who's on tuning in today. I just want to remind everybody. So, if you'd like to learn more about Sally's work and pick up one of her books, you can find her at SallyHelgesen.com, Sally, HelGesen.com. And you'll find more about me and Transfluence and I'm going to definitely have to spell this one, WaltRakowich.com, WaltRakowich. Keep an eye out for future live streams. And until then, I hope you find a way to have a positive influence on those around you each and every day. Thank you. Thank you again, Sally.
Thank you, Walt. Really enjoyed this.
Loved having you on.
It was great.